The last episode of the Pax Romana podcast saw the death of Caracalla, an emperor who reigned for less than a decade, but still did quite a bit of damage in the age of decline that followed the Pax Romana. Caracalla was replaced by his own praetorian prefect, a man named Macrinus. Macrinus probably engineered the assassination of Caracalla, with one of his soldiers or co-conspirators murdering Caracalla while he urinated, and then the assassin became the fall guy. Macrinus had him executed before he could spill the beans and tell everyone who had put the assassin up to the task of assassinating the emperor. So with Caracalla dead, Macrinus took over in AD 217. But as we'll see today, he would neither reign nor live very long. Why did things go so badly for Macrinus so quickly? We'll talk about that on this episode of the Pax Romana podcast. Episode 68, Macrinus, Emperor for a Moment. Macrinus was the first Roman emperor from Mauritania, a North African province just to the west of Carthage, a land ruled directly by Rome for over 2 centuries. Macrinus was an equestrian, so he was by no means a nobody, not a senator, but a wealthy landowner, well-networked in the Roman hierarchy, and as head of the Praetorian Guard, deeply influential in Roman politics. It says a lot that he accompanied Caracalla on his trip to fight Parthians in Persia, and it's likely that Caracalla did not see the betrayal coming. And then Macrinus was made emperor by a claim of the Roman soldiers that were with him there in Syria. Macrinus decided not to carry out Caracalla's war with the Parthians, but instead sued for peace with the Parthian king. The Parthians, however, would have none of it. The Parthians decided to take advantage of the uncertainty due to the shaky transition of power, the assassination of Caracalla, of course. Parthian army was mobilized and fought with Macrinus' troops at the city of Nisibis. Both sides suffered heavy losses in the battle. We don't know the numbers. We just know that it was costly for both sides. The Greek writer Herodian tells us that the entire field of battle was littered with corpses, some of them piled up into small hills and heaps. Macrinus was able to extricate himself from what was likely to be a loss by offering the Parthian king 200 million sesterces, and these were almost certainly paid in silver or gold, not in bronze coinage, and probably not in the debased coinage of Caracalla. As you might remember from the episodes on Caracalla, one of his monetary reforms was to change the Roman currency to move it away from the silver denarius and towards a new coin, a double denarius that he minted, which historians call the Antoninianus. But that coin was heavily debased and seems to have been mistrusted almost from the very beginning of when it was minted. Macrinus decided to cease minting that coin, and he reverted instead to the denarius. Now, his denarius was just as debased as those of previous emperors, but by getting rid of the Antoninianus, a coin which everybody knew was adulterated, Macrinus sent a signal that maybe he was going to try to stabilize the monetary system. And of course, he needed to mint at least halfway decent coins to pay the Parthian king so that he wouldn't suffer a major defeat at the very beginning of his reign, a reign that began, of course, with a coup. You can get a sense already for just how unstable things were for Macrinus, and the situation did not improve. Having bought a peace with Parthia, Macrinus had to deal with troubles in both Armenia and Dacia. And he hadn't even made it back to Rome yet. He was still over in the east. The Armenians were upset because Caracalla had installed a governor, whereas the Armenians had been ruled by kings for centuries. And it did not take well to being treated as some Roman province. They were a kingdom with a long and storied history. Okay, not an empire, but a major player in the wars that had been raging for centuries between the Romans and the Persians. Armenia was a kingmaker, and they valued their independence. Yes, they switched sides often, allying with Rome for a few years, before then allying with Parthia for a few years, but they certainly didn't view themselves as a province of either empire. And when Caracalla put a governor over Armenia, they were deeply unhappy and rebelled against Rome, and Macrinus had to deal with that crisis as well. Wisely, Macrinus took a humble approach to Armenia, restoring the kingdom, removing the governor, and allowed Armenia to once again have its nominal independence. This secured peace. As for Dacia, Caracalla had taken hostages from some of the Dacian tribes in order to secure good behavior. The northern Roman border had become a hotbed of conflict, especially along the Danube, so Caracalla had taken hostages in the hope of securing peace. This only angered the Dacians and made rebellion even more likely. Macrinus again took a humble approach and released the hostages that had been taken by Caracalla, securing a temporary peace along the Danube. In reality, Macrinus just needed some stability so he could establish himself. But members of the aristocracy, and probably even some of his own soldiers, saw these prudent actions as weak. And although Macrinus was buying himself peace, he was also sowing seeds of skepticism and even disloyalty among soldiers and senators, groups that he needed in order to form a new government. But the measure that probably led to his ultimate downfall has to do with soldier pay. As Septimius Severus had said to his son Caracalla, "Enrich the soldiers, scorn all other men," Macrinus would have been wise to adhere to this advice, but he didn't. Macrinus seems to have sought to put the Roman Empire on a firmer financial footing, which meant not continuing to debase the coinage and also cutting spending, and Rome's biggest expenditures were on the military. Macrinus did not honor the pay rises that were promised by Caracalla, at least to new soldiers that he had just recruited. They were compensated at a lower rate than the people that were serving alongside of them. This, when combined with the lack of military victories, and indeed what was perceived as a dovish foreign policy, caused Macrinus' soldiers to begin looking elsewhere already, not even a year into his reign, for somebody else to lead them, somebody who would defeat Rome's enemies and also compensate the soldiers at the levels to which they had become accustomed. The most obvious place to look would be with the family of the previous regime. Now, the immediate successors of the Severans, Caracalla and his brother Geta, were all dead. The matriarch of that family, Julia Domna, was also dead. She had committed suicide after hearing about the death of Caracalla. She basically shut down, refusing food and water, dying a slow and painful death in the city of Antioch in Syria. But Julia Domna had a sister. Her name was also Julia Misa. Julia Misa was therefore Caracalla's aunt. She was also a wealthy woman and influential in the region where many Roman soldiers were, right there in Syria. That was her ancestral home. Now, Julia Misa did not have a son. She had daughters. And the oldest of her daughter's sons was a teenager named Varius Avitus Bassianus, but he would be known to history as Elagabalus, and so we'll go ahead and call him that now. Elagabalus was just 14 years old, and as the son of a noble Syrian house, he took up service in the cult of the local sun god El-Gabal. And while El-Gabal was local, sun gods were worshipped across the ancient world, especially by soldiers. So already this boy was seen as pious, if not favored by the sun god. Now that wouldn't be enough to make Elagabalus emperor, but Julia Misa knew what Rome's soldiers were really after. She offered substantial sums to the soldiers. That's right, she straight up bribed them in order to rise up against Macrinus and defect to her grandson Elagabalus. And unsurprisingly, with all that was going on, thousands of soldiers took her up on her offer. Julia Misa also started a rumor that the recently deceased Emperor Caracalla had slept with her daughter 14 years prior, and that Elagabalus was actually the illegitimate son of the previous emperor. Who knows how many people actually believed it? Probably very few. But this vague claim provided a convenient lie to give a thin veil of legitimacy to Elagabalus, who otherwise had no real claim on the imperial throne. At this point, in the middle of AD 218, Macrinus was still in the east, hunkered down in the city of Antioch, a city well known for its veteran population and the staging ground for foreign wars. As a result, it was a defensible position should he find himself in a civil war, and indeed one was brewing, and this rapidly. In fact, by May of AD 218, an entire legion of Roman soldiers had acclaimed Elagabalus as their emperor. Again, all of this is happening away from Rome. And although there would be members of the Senate nearby trying to pick sides, the main body of the Roman Senate had very little say in what was going on. Their job was simply to wait for news of who won the Civil War and decide what they were going to do, which of course, if they wanted to live, would be to side with the winner and declare him emperor. They didn't have to wait long. In June of AD 218, the forces of Elagabalus and Macrinus fought in a battle near the city of Antioch. Macrinus lost that battle, which supposedly was run in part by Julia Misa. Now, although many of Macrinus' soldiers died, he survived, fleeing the field of battle, running back as fast as he could to Italy. Macrinus' strategy was desperate. He had hoped to reach the Senate ahead of any courier that could report the actual result of the battle so that he could tell the Senate that he won instead of Elagabalus, and maybe use the time to shore up some support, raise an army from the Western legions, live to fight, and maybe even win another day. Unfortunately for Macrinus, he was captured and executed before he could put his plans into motion. It's unlikely that he could have arrested the downward trajectory of the Roman Empire, but who knows? And with his death, the boy Elagabalus became Rome's youngest emperor ever. And as we'll see on the next episode, Elagabalus's reign was brief but notorious and chaotic, one of Rome's most scandal-plagued emperors. The dark years of the sun priest Elagabalus on the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Pax Romana podcast. For more information, including a list of primary sources and further reading, check the show notes. Music by Red Productions and Exocore. Follow Professor Colin Elliott on X at ProfCPE or email colin@paxromanapodcast.com. Listen to more episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or just about anywhere podcasts are available. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.